All right, well, I did a quick test. It looks like it's working. So today I'm going to do a book tour on a book I just finished reading, Rome. Now I noticed that I did a book talk on this. Seemingly I was at page 300 when I did that talk. I didn't listen to the whole thing, so I don't know how much I talked about the book, but I'm gonna make like I didn't do that and just talk about this book, which, by the way, I think is a very good book. Lots and lots and lots of information on on Rome. And as it says right here, a cultural, visual, and personal history. Now, cultural is adequately describing the fact that the author, Robert Hughes, is getting on his pages of his book a great deal of information about the art history of Rome, and that's the main emphasis of this book is the art and the arts, the painters, the architects, the movers and shakers behind that, which, generally speaking, in the early part of the Roman Empire, it was the emperors who were the patrons of the art and set the stage for what was going to be built. Then, as the history of Rome proceeded, it became the popes who were the big movers and shakers behind the arts. The popes would get Michelangelo up and running, working on that Sistine Chapel. They would get many an architect and builder working on the buildings and other structures in Rome. There's a lot they had to do because in the beginning there was nothing. It was just the 7 hills. They had to do a lot of building to create Rome. And they did, from what I could tell, they did a pretty good job. Of course, a lot of negative activities got in the way. There was some destruction, obviously. A very long period of time, so something like, I think they mentioned the Pantheon, and something like 2,400 years. I think, I'm not sure, because I keep getting the Pantheon mixed up with the Parthenon. That's the one in Greece, the Greek Parthenon. And not for anything, the Romans were big duplicators of what the Greek artists and builders did. So it doesn't strike me as odd that the Roman temple, the Pantheon, looks a great deal like the Parthenon. Uh, so in his book, like I say, I think it's worth reading. He, the author, breaks it up, makes sense in the way he breaks it up. Writes about the different periods, and in those periods he talks about the important people, the popes, the emperors, the artists, and when he's got a wrap on a certain area, he'll go into the next area. Time frame, they're broken up in things like the Renaissance, the early days, the Christians, broken up into the BCE, before the Common Era, and he talks about Constantine, the Byzantine Empire. In the beginning, he's talking about that. He's talking about the early Christian era. Talks about the different popes. And as that's going on, he jumps into the Crusades, which is a big part of the history of Rome, because for the most part, it was the popes who was spearheading the Crusades. And the popes, for the most part, were situated in Rome. Now, they were also situated in a city in France for quite some time. And they could have set out for the Crusades while the Pope was still in that French city. While the people who were entrusted with the invasion of the Holy Land were, for the most part, as far as I could tell, they weren't too tightly wrapped up in their heads. They were a little eccentric. I would go so far as to say that they were more or less whack jobs. But but nothing they wanted more than to go and spill blood, because when you did that, you showed the rest of the world what a great guy you were. How brave and this, that, and the other thing. So they jumped on a bandwagon for that. And I think the First Crusade was successful, but they weren't generally all that successful, these crusades. When you see the art depicting the Crusaders, you always see a big red cross on their tunic. That was some sort of material, and the cross was sewn on the tunic, which is something I wouldn't have come up with. I would have felt that it was right on the metal breastplate that the soldiers would have been wearing, but they were sewn on. the I forget which crusade it was. Maybe it was the fourth, and it took a lot to get that one off the ground. Basically, it was money problems. Didn't have enough money to do this. So the Pope and the leaders of the Crusaders, and at that time I think it was Richard the Lionhearted, they cut a deal if the Pope would give them some money and Venice would give them some ships and all this. They would get funded and they could go to the Holy Land. So they were pretty happy about that. They went, but before they went, they took a couple of side trips, and they managed to lay siege to a city near Constantinople. And then they also made a siege of Constantinople itself. And from what I gather from reading this book, my memory serves me, there were a great deal of murder and mayhem went on by the Crusaders. The individual soldiers would be told not to loot, and of course they looted. They got everything they could possibly get. And they did get onto the Holy Land, and if I remember correctly, that was a win. If I remember correctly, you could see that I probably stayed up too late last night. It's a shame. Listen, and while I was reading all of this, I was constantly saying to myself, well, we're not in Rome. Where's Rome? Where's Rome? So the author is declaring that, the cultural history will be part of his talk on Rome. So when we say the cultural history, we're including those folks who were the bigwigs living in Rome, i.e. the popes. And let me tell you, those popes, they were amazing. As soon as they got installed, man, they broke out the carpentry equipment and bam, they went to work. Because I guess it was the thing to do to make structures that would be able to remind people about how great they were. It was very important to be great back then. Very important. And one of the popes reigned for a very long time. To me, I think it was 37 years. That would have been Pius the Ninth. Now, and he did major buildings and works. During this whole period that this book is talking about, there are many, many, many artists, most of whom I had never heard of. I'm no art historian, and the history of Rome, for some strange reason, never was something that I thought to dig into but it's obvious I should have because this is Western civilization, Rome. Although it got a little wacky there at the end with old Mussolini, it did get a little wacky. Although this author has kind words to say about Mussolini, where he has absolutely nothing ever good to say about the maggot over there in Germany. Never. He was top evil. And this author lays it on the line. Now, Mussolini, of course, he saw the writing on the wall, so he was going to do a little kissing up to the Fuhrer. And I think, it was a lost cause. Mussolini was never going to be able to march step by step, shoulder to shoulder with the crazy maggot slaughterer. And one statistic is all you need to know. Mosey had about 700,000 men for his army. The maggot, the Teutonic maggot, had 7 million. So it's a 10-to-1 ratio. And Hitler just let Mussolini play the role of being an ally. He could have squashed him like a gnat. And of course, talking about Rome, that's the name of the book, Mussolini is a big part of that. Hitler is not a part of Rome. I would say that he's not even a part of Western civilization. That Hitler. Obviously, he was not a civilization. He was the opposite, the antithesis of civilization. He was a nightmare, a horror. And you don't need, if you're trying to learn about Rome, you really don't need to know Hitler. Hitler could be expunged from all the history books in the world, and it wouldn't make an ounce of difference to our understanding. Other than we would always, I believe, want to keep in mind the awful horrors that were created by Hitler. Mussolini was playing both sides of the street. He was doing good works. He's constantly remarked about building hospitals for the orphans and, helping the poor of his country. But, when push came to shove and he had to kill, he killed. I mean, what he did in Africa with the Ethiopians, atrocities. Same thing. They all do it. They all do it. They all did it. They have a lot of famous little sayings about their about the leaders of the world and the propensity to commit murder, mayhem. And that's one of the things I got from this book was the concentration.
Unknown caller.
well, they'll stay unknown. So, throughout the book, the discussions about the movers and shakers, whether they're the artists, the politicians, they seem to be concerned about committing atrocities. They did. The artists would get together to protest. They would, like a band of brothers, I think they used that term, to try to combat the evil in the world. The problem with that, of course, is that the artist population is small. You're not going to do anything. So, but their hearts were in the right place, a lot of them. And I think, having finished this book, that the art world got shortchanged in that the I want to call it the fiction that was fed to the masses about how awful the artists of the world were and are, and how their cultures and activities are so degrading. I think that in general, it probably wasn't true. Just because you don't like the way somebody paints or how they create a piece of sculpture doesn't make them evil, doesn't make them bad. So, but I think the propaganda that was shot towards the masses was always trying to put the art world in a bad place. I think for reasons that hardly make sense, because the powers that be probably were put out, probably were concerned and worried that these people with horrible ideas were going to influence too many people, and that the world would become more like the artists than the workman. Now, let's face it. The world works off the sweat and the back of the workman. So it works. The workman does the work, and the upper classes, they get the benefit. And now in the art world, you can see, reading this book, that a great deal of the folks who were being artists were not from the lower classes. There were some. Actually, there were some very important ones who came from the lower classes. But for the most part, they were sons of minor bureaucrats and this, that, and the other thing. They weren't the poor. There was enough poor. You didn't have to go looking for them. They were all over the place. And the great thing about this book is that once he got started, it was a little slow starting. Once he got started, he never looked back. Never looked back. It just more and more and more information. And like I said, the names of these artists, I never heard of them. And they're great. Now, some of them, of course, I heard, but a lot of them, never heard them. When you read a book like this, you're going to be exposed, hopefully, to many things that perhaps you never were. And if that's the case, that's a good thing. And I believe this book, after reading it, goodness gracious, there's just so much that to know as far as Rome and and what it meant and what it still means to Western civilization. Of course, they get a bad rap. The smarty pants in the well-off countries around the world loved and probably still love to poke fun at the Italians. Well, that's fine, you poke fun all you want. Doesn't change anything. We all know the story about what happened at Mussolini. Things were getting tight. I guess by this time, Patton was already charging up the Adriatic, no, not the Adriatic, the other coast of Italy. And Mussolini sort of writing on the wall. And he arranged to get a good deal of cash and his girlfriend, and they tried to slip away, but it wasn't happening. Mussolini and his girlfriend, they got the communists. You can always count on a communist to do something atrocious, okay? And the commies stepped in and they begged Mussolini and his girlfriend, and maybe a dozen or so of their entourage. They begged them, and then some smaller city, a name you've never heard of, they brought him there, and they shot him. And then they were infamously, this is the story everybody knows, they were hung upside down from the awning of a gas station. I'm pretty sure it was that. Very ignoble ending to El Duce. He was also a man of humble birth. Now, although he got an education that we would expect any child in America to get these days. You go to grammar school, a little high school, and then you're sent to the mines. So he got at least that much of an education. Now, the fact that the Italian people living in Rome and elsewhere, they actually admired him, and they had a certain amount of love for Mussolini until, the writing was on a wall and he started to figure out that what he was doing wasn't good for them. Then they didn't like him anymore. But the and you're gonna like this book because, like I said, it covers, just the whole gamut of the art history, which, for better or worse, became the history of Rome, because the architect and so on is. And the people who were the architects in the buildings is well covered in this book. And it becomes the major emphasis, whether it was the Sistine Chapel, which is just, that's so often talked about. I shouldn't even have to say it, but, things like that. But others, like, for example, there's one that I got impressed with, something called the Spanish Steps that were built early on in the history of Rome. Some of us got this in grammar school about the aqueducts that they built, but they were quite the deal. And we often hear about the fountains of Rome, and they got their water power to squirt those water out of the fountains simply by hooking up to the aqueduct, because there was a couple of 100 feet of drop that provided the power for the water in those cities and the fountains. So they didn't need a pump. It was just the pressure, differential pressure from the springs up in the hills around Rome. And I think, throw a number out there, I think some of those aqueducts traversed about a couple of 100 miles to get into the cities. And they necessitated a lot of repair over the years. A lot of repair, just as much of Rome did, because it was the building material. A lot of it was subject to erosion, limestone, concrete, such, clay. So you had to fix that every 100 years or so. Kept them busy. No doubt about that. Kept the workers working. No doubt about that. And I had a big problem while reading this book, in that I would constantly lose my place. I was using some, scroungy little slip of paper, and it would fall out. I wouldn't know where I was. So I was rereading a lot of the book. And, I would say, oh, I read this already, but I didn't just say, okay, I'm not going to reread it. I reread and reread and reread, probably 6 or more times, where I'd lost my place and I had to go back and try to figure out where I was and start reading it all over again. But the book was so well written, there was so many facts that I wanted to cover, that I didn't once I knew that, okay, yeah, I was here, I didn't just jump ahead. I reread it and reread it and reread it. And it was very cool, I thought. The last chapter is something called Rome Recaptured. And he goes into an area of the arts that only in the 20th century became recognized as a branch of the arts, and that would be the film industry. And so I get to read about these fairly famous movie directors. The one in mind is Federico Fellini with his La Volta Dolce, or whatever it is, La Viva Dolce, 8.5, and a bunch of others. But he became like a phenomenon, big time. And this was an example of great art coming out of Rome, coming out of Italy, that survived, that lived on through the 20th century. Because for the most part, based on this book, art was done in Italy as well as it was done, according to this book, in the rest of the world. But the films were capable of performing the function assigned to art in any true civilization. The films. And Fellini was number one. Now, one of the great things about reading is that you pick up little things here and there, and you say, "Oh, that's why." So I got one of those things with the movies and Fellini. When I was much younger, a Fellini movie would come on the TV, and I would always find it a little difficult to get into it because they seemed to be all over the place. You know, a Hollywood movie, you know how they're going to progress. And they generally are not all over the place. So the Fellini movie was this, then he changed to that, and changed to the other thing. And you might have a hard time staying with it, which I did when I would watch these movies. So this book points out that, like with the Fellini movie, I think it's La Viva Volta Dei, something. La Volta Dei, you know the one I'm talking about. But it's because he actually did it like in 8 pieces. You know, and the abrupt endings to one piece, and then, you know, in their mind, the directors and what have you, they don't see a problem with just leaving one scene, and the next thing you know, you're in a whole different scene, whole different things, and you have to connect the dots. And I wasn't capable of connecting the dots in a way that was meaningful for me. So this book, the author actually says that's what Fellini did, and he did it well, according to this author, and he made art. He made art. So there you go, folks. If you're a big Fellini fan, you were watching art. And that's not a man's name. It's art. So I talked about Rome. Robert Hughes. I highly recommend it. I don't see how you need the knowledge that is in this book to be a functioning human being in our society. You need it. Now, most people don't have it. So you draw your own conclusions on that one. And by the way, he's no fan of the modern times. This guy, Robert Hughes, no fan at all. It's just, these folks have all lost it. Lost it. And it's a terrible thing because I think the Greeks and the Romans had something going. And they didn't care to keep it going. And now we have what we have. Modernity. So that's Rome, that's Robert Hughes. I'm going to knock this off now. And I'll see you next book talk or whatever else I do.